Agile.FM, radio for the Agile community. www.agile.fm. Welcome to Agile.FM. Today I have Jeff Patton with me. Jeff can be reached at Jeff Patton in one word on Twitter. He is also behind jpattanassociates.com. But to be honest, he doesn't need an introduction. He's the author of User Story Mapping. He won the 2007 Gordon Pask Award. His background is has been for a long, long time, extreme programming. He's a certified Scrum trainer. And I recently met him at the conference in Munich. And we decided to have a little bit of a chat here on Agile.FM. But before we get started, welcome to the podcast, Jeff.
Thanks, Joe. I'm super happy to be here.
Very cool. We have a few things to talk about, and one of the things is products, right? So products is something you're very passionate about. From a manifesto's perspective, your talks, you distinguish quite clearly between projects and products and customers and users and what people do refer to as the business, like in quotes here, written in the manifesto. Why is that, Jeff?
Well, I've always been in a product company. I started with software development in the 1990s, and I started by building software for consumers. I started at a small product company early on, and we built software for sale. And when we said customer, we always meant the person who bought our product. But what was weird for me is I got my start with extreme programming in 2000. I got recruited into a company that had hired Kent Beck, the guy who wrote the book Extreme Programming Explained, and my business card said product manager, but my extreme programming role was customer. And learning that in XP I was a customer kind of made things weird. Later on in 2001, the Agile Manifesto was written, and every time the customers referenced in the Agile Manifesto, I kind of wonder who they're talking about. Are they talking about also the business is referenced there? And I came from a product company. We never referred to ourselves as the business or IT. We were just the people who built the product, and there wasn't an us and them sort of feeling. There just wasn't. It wasn't that way. It was that way for me up until about 2005 when I became a consultant and I started working in larger companies, and that language around the business and that idea that we're treating the business as the customer is something I've been kind of fighting against. It's odd. It doesn't seem quite right.
Yeah, who are customers? Like, if we make this analogy to from the manifesto to what you see as customers, are these just people using, or also the word user, right? So how does this relate to the world you see things in?
So these days, what I teach in consulting is all product ownership, product management stuff in conjunction with Agile. But I'll separate customer from user. Customers are the people who choose to buy a product. Or we'll talk about users versus choosers. The chooser word comes from a guy named Luke Holman. I've heard him first say that, and that struck me. With the consumer product, it's easy to mistake one for the other. For consumer product, I buy my own product, so I'm both chooser and then user. So I make a choice for the product and then I use it. But I started by building software for large brick and mortar retailers, the stuff that they use at point of sale and all the way into the back office. The company I started at years ago got bought by Salesforce, so it's now part of Salesforce's massive thing. But for companies like that, the chooser is very different from the user. The user is the person at the cash register or the person in the back office. The chooser are the people at the corporate office that went through a long RFP process and made a decision to buy a product. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, no. So when you do work with clients or when you're teaching clients in your thinking, who's your prime suspect here in terms of who you're working for or building things for? Is Is it the user, the chooser, or the customer, or
When
all of the
I'm
above?
when I'm teaching,
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
so that's one of the first things I'll do is if I teach a public class, especially, or is ask people in the room to sort of sort themselves to figure out who I'm working with. If I teach a public class, I'll sort people into a two by two. And you have to picture this. I know this is not exactly the question you answer, but I want to answer the public class question first, then talk about who I work with usually.
Okay.
Look, if you imagine a two by two, on the bottom left-hand side, you put on the far left-hand side, you put people who write software that's built for use inside their own company. Meaning, I build software that's used by people who work for my own company. And at the far right-hand side, you put software that we sell. So our company makes its money by selling software. Sort of in the middle, sometimes you have consumer-facing websites. We don't sell the website. If you work for a bank, banks sell bank accounts. They don't sell websites, but you might be building something consumer-facing. So there's a continuum of we build it for inside use for our own people to we build it for outside use to all the way we make our company makes its money selling this software. And then on a top to bottom axis, I'll put at the very top, I'll put the situation where users are the choosers. The ones who put hands on keyboards and use the software every day are also the ones who decided to use it. Mm-hmm. And on the very bottom, I'll put where users are not choosers, meaning the people that use the software didn't choose to use it. And if they want to stop using the software, they have to quit their job. They don't have a choice. And then I'll ask people in the room, we'll do that human sorting thing. I'll ask people to sort themselves, and I'll find out top right-hand corner is usually reserved for consumer-facing products. Bottom right-hand quadrant, a lot of enterprise-class products. People that would work at SAP or at PeopleSoft or Oracle or things like that would be down there. Bottom left-hand corner is where a lot of traditional IT stuff comes from. This is where a lot of early Agile development came from. Extreme programming is a process. Early projects were building payroll systems in Chrysler. Top left-hand quadrant, that's for systems we build internally, but the ones that users don't have to use. Things like internal information systems, internal wikis or portals or things like that. It's built for internal use, but users don't have to use it. What you call a product or what a product owner is really different in all those contexts. And who the customer is and who the user is really different in all those contexts. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
That makes total sense, yeah. And thanks for the visual you put in front of everyone.
Yeah. Ask people to imagine that if you're driving, you don't stop and draw that.
Definitely.
But sometimes the companies that hire me come from that top right-hand quadrant. And in those situations, I'm working with people who are product managers and product teams. Sometimes people are in the bottom right-hand quadrant. Those are usually bigger companies. You and I just met in Germany, and I've worked with. It's funny, on the top right-hand quadrant, there's a company called Ableton in Berlin that makes software for musicians, and worked with them directly. Bottom right-hand quadrant, I worked with SAP directly, and then bottom left-hand quadrant, I've done a lot of work with banks and things like that. That's where a lot of those people come from. Mm-hmm. It's the right-hand side that I usually see some kind of understanding of products and what our products are and when we make our money on products. But it's as you drift more to the left-hand side, that's where you get this weird thing where you get this, what I'll talk about as a client vendor or a customer vendor anti-pattern, where IT starts treating the business like the customer. In that situation, if IT behaves like a service and it treats itself like a customer, then its job becomes making the business happy by building software, which is not the same thing. If you think of a product that you love, one that you would tell other people about it, you wouldn't tell people I love this software because it was delivered on time or because it has more features. You love what the product does for you. And product success isn't about on-time delivery. It isn't about more. It's about more of the right things. But if you're a service company, like if you're IT, well, there's no end to the stuff that the business wants. So if you're a service company, success starts to be more. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. I would almost say, like, at least in my experience, it's hardly ever really important if the project was on time. I mean, it's somewhere in that neighborhood of the time frame. It's much more important if the right product has been released.
Yeah, and you tell if something is right because customers see it, adopt it, and use it, and keep using it. And if it's software they have to use, then their jobs become easier or more efficient. And you measure success based upon that, whether people use and become more efficient using the software, not on-time delivery. But when in so many organizations, so many teams, their sole focus starts to be on-time delivery of more stuff or getting more stuff done on time.
Yeah. I'm here with Jeff Patton talking about user story mapping in a little bit. We just touched on product, customer, users, and the business, and had a wonderful example for it. And we're going to return back to this podcast in just 1 minute. Agile is all about inspection and adaptation, and so is Agile.FM. If you like the show, please visit the show page of Agile.FM on iTunes and leave a comment rating for us. You can now also visit Agile.FM, the website, and leave a comment about a specific individual episode online. Well, we're here with Jeff Patton, and we'll talk about user story mapping. I have a few questions about this as well, Jeff, because I feel like this podcast we can use almost like a kind of a myth-buster kind of episode, and it's really about user stories as well. We're getting a lot of questions around user stories, and I would love to have you just touch on a few topics here, if that's okay with you, around user stories. You wrote the book, User Story Mapping. I have recently, like for the past years, people were talking about, well, it all started with user stories, right? And at some point, years ago, people started talking about epics. Now, maybe in the last 12 months or so, I heard people talk about sagas more. and what I'm also...
Tell me, what's the definition of a saga?
Right, exactly, right? So what I'm maybe it's already enough to just talk about user stories and epics, but the big question is, many organizations now are actually trying to get epics and then trying to break down, and then sometimes you hear like weird things such as they're writing a user story and where's the epic to that, right? And I feel like we're going into a breakdown kind of mode. Where do you see all these things and puzzle pieces move together here?
First, I've got a lot of opinions about that. I spend a lot of time reminding people that stories aren't another word for requirements or specifications or things like that. That I remind people stories get their name from not how we write them, but how we use them. The original intent behind stories was you could write down anything that you wanted a team to do, and it became a story because you would tell the story. You would talk about, you would explain it. Stories were sort of a cure to a lot of traditional forms of requirements, where traditional forms of requirements are prone to misunderstanding or prone to argument about what the right way to write it is. And the idea was, it doesn't matter what you write or how you write it. If you bring whatever you wrote down and we sit down and talk about it, then the goal is that face-to-face conversation brings us shared understanding. So however you wrote it, we get shared understanding, and somebody who wants something needs to talk to somebody who can build something, and together they get their heads on the same page. Now, So that's where stories get their name. But there's this idea that we eventually agree on what we're going to build, and we have to build something. But one of the characteristics of agile development is we want to build small things. We want to build the least we possibly can and see something working soon. So there's this tension to, yes, we need to talk together, but we need to focus on building small things. Another hidden thing in the stories is to move that focus to, we want to move our discussion to discussing value. We talk a lot about who, what, and why. Who would use this and why they would use it. And if we keep the focus on value, that moves the conversation to say, okay, what's the smallest thing we could build that would give us value? So there's this idea of small. But the problem is anything we want to build is big. You can't build something in a couple days. Any product you use on any app on your mobile device, any piece of software that you use, isn't something that took a developer or a team a few days to build. Mm-hmm. It's something that took hundreds, thousands of hours to build. So we run into this decomposition problem. Mm-hmm. So the original idea of stories was it changed the way you work so that you talk to each other, focus on value, try to agree on small things to build. But stories left the whole idea of, one of the problems you're meant to solve with stories is how do you break big things down into small things? And it doesn't matter. Someone coined the term epic to refer to, just because an epic sounds like it's a bigger story. But okay, that's a big thing. And I guess I've heard the term saga used to indicate that it's multiple stories that sort of chain together, that go together. Joe, I might have lost the plot, but all of these, there's a lot of different ways to talk about stories, but ultimately it doesn't matter. It's just big things that break down into small things. And you use storytelling and stories to break them down any way you want. But the minute you start trying to put a taxonomy on these things is the minute it just gets messy and we start to regress. We regress into this old requirements gathering kinds of junk that we struggle with even before Agile development.
Right, and that's what I'm nervous about, that this whole user story movement is going to, right? That we see so much process around how to create user stories, whereas in the past it was like just write it down on a card, have a conversation and get your confirmation. And now what we're seeing is this, it's almost like a process flow in large organizations about how to get from a saga to an epic to a user story, and it just seems very counterproductive to where we wanted to be.
So every organization is working hard organizations want to track requirements from big ideas down to small ideas. They want to have some way to. It's this focus on. We started by talking about this focus on scope, this focus on how much we're delivering, and not how successful it is. People want some way to take a big thing and know how it's broken down into small things and know if we're really, really done with the whole big thing.
Yeah. Well, talking about all that scoping here and the various things we just talked about, how does the concept of an MVP, in your opinion, fit into all this? And what is an MVP in the first place? Another myth I think we have to bust.
So this is the beginning of a big conversation. So I've got a couple talks and I teach about this a lot. The original concept of MVP, it's short for minimum viable product. Mm-hmm. The term was coined in 2001 and it came out of a lot of work done by people throughout the 1990s. The idea was we want a product that is super successful on the market. And the original term viable meant it was successful. It was a product we could sell and would earn return on investment. It would support our business. So viable meant that. And all software we build is sort of a risk. It's a bit of a gamble. We don't know what the market is going to buy. We don't know how much they need. And what we want, one of the things people do when they don't know is they hedge by putting everything that people ask for into a release. Mm-hmm. But if we put everything in there, that takes a lot longer. That reduces the return on investment. And sometimes if you put too much in it, it can actually kind of mess up the value proposition of the product. But on the opposite side, if we put too little in there, it's not enough for people to use, and that's not viable, or that's not successful either. So the goal was to identify, and it was super hard to identify a minimum viable product, the smallest product we could release that would be successful. That's what the term originally meant. And what happened is that the term was hard. The people, a guy named Frank Robinson originally coined the phrase, and he described the process of research and testing and experimentation that we used to try and figure out what the smallest product we could deliver and that would be successful was. Now, in 2011, Eric Ries wrote a book called The Lean Startup, and in that book, he said that, the problem with that MVP concept was all what we're doing is guessing. And a lot of people had interpreted that MVP as a decision our company needed to make. Yes, it's true. It's a decision, but you make that decision based upon a lot of testing and research, ideally. Eric said what we need, he redefined MVP to the smallest thing we could do or make to test a product hypothesis, to test what we believe is true. So in the Reese definition, this is where you get things like landing page tests and using prototypes as an MVP and A/B tests and small releases to a small subset of customers. So the original definition was small successful release that earns us ROI. The Eric Ries definition, or the Lean Startup definition, is anything we could do to test our idea up until the point of a successful product release. How can I say it? The definitions are polar opposites of each other. One meant successful release, one meant test. And which
one resonates better with you personally?
Both concepts. So when I teach to product people, they need to understand both concepts. Both are incredibly important. They need to. Your company doesn't make any money unless you actually get a product that is viable. And secondarily, the way you figure that out is by testing a lot of ideas, by building small things, by building experiments, by putting them out in front of customers. So both concepts are important. And the problem is right now the term has been so polluted that you just can't use it. Those two concepts are important. In teaching, I try and tell this story about what MVP was and how it kind of went sideways, how it can mean about anything these days. And so the two terms I'll use in the context of teaching are smallest successful release and next best test. So I'll ask people is, how confident are you this release is going to be successful? And if you're not confident, then what's the next best thing we could do to test that or be more sure? So next best test, that's an Eric Ries MVP. Right. Smallest successful release, that's an original Robinson definition.
Awesome. All right, very cool. Jeff, the next one, if you're going in the myth list here, right, is probably super straightforward, a question you probably have heard many, many times, but just want to bring this here also to the listeners here. Definition of a feature versus user story or a vertical slice. And the separation. Do you have a good example for how to distinguish these things? Or
feature versus a user story versus, you said, a vertical slice?
Yep. Slicing is a very popular term, and people keep slicing user stories. At least that's one of the experiences I hear quite a bit.
Oh, I don't know how to do that.
Maybe do the feature versus the user story.
Oh, see, all of those are kind of messed up. We talked, when I talk about a story I pound on, I help people, and this may twist your head if you've been thinking about a story as a thing you're supposed to build. A story is things become, you can take anything that you were working with before and call it a story by changing the way you work, by making sure that you collaborate and focus on shared understanding and also keep the focus on value. So when I talk about a story, I see a story as a container. I can put anything in a container. I can talk about a feature. I can talk about a use case. I can talk about anything. And I can, so a story is sort of an empty box. But as soon as I put something in a story, it kind of prescribes a way of working, of collaborating. So stories don't need to be small or large or anything. A story can be about something that will take a year to build. A story can be about something that will take a couple days to build. Now, the size of thing that I want to build in a next iteration or a next development cycle is something that takes a couple days. So we have to start with something that's big and eventually we'll break it down to something that is small. But we use a story-driven process to do that. Everybody's seen a representation of a backlog that starts with big things and breaks down to small things. Mm-hmm. All of those big things and small things are stories. Doesn't matter if you call the big thing an epic and the small thing a story, but it's kind of a continuum. If you put at one end the word epic and one end the word story that'll take a couple days to build, that's ready for development, I don't know what you call all the variants of gray in between. Mm-hmm. So a story is a way to work, and everything can be a story regardless of how big it is. Now, when you build, there's this hope that you're building something that is a vertical slice, and what most people think of as a vertical slice is something that is functionality that cuts from user interface down to whatever you use for a persistence layer these days. It's not a database almost anymore, but it's something that it's functionality we can see and use. Mm-hmm. So that's the aspiration. But look, I was working with, I had somebody in a class recently that was building software they provided a framework for people who did IoT, Internet of Things kind of development. So, for them, their software didn't have a user interface. It was an API that was called. Mm-hmm. And they build a lot of things that don't have UI. So what's a vertical slice when you're building something that's cloud-based or something that's IoT-based? Mm-hmm. That gets a little wacky too when we don't know what the layers are anymore. But vertical normally means it's functional.
Exactly. Yeah. Right. Awesome. Yeah. So I think maybe we're redefining some of those things for some of the listeners, and it's always good to get some new, fresh ideas on these things, right? So you might pick up something here from Jeff that is something you can try, change, and maybe choose some different kind of wording in organizations. Now, the book you wrote is the user story mapping. Yeah. I wanted to touch on one thing here. It's like I feel like a lot of organizations, they write user stories. They have, as you just said, like a backlog. They move things in there. But the actual activity of putting things on the floor or on a wall and mapping things is very often done only in workshops or sometimes not even done at all, actually quite frequently. Why do you think that is, and what are the companies missing out on by not doing that?
So for people that don't know, a story map is a super simple model. It describes a product or a feature or a thing ideally from a user's perspective, and left to right, it tells a story. It's a flow, and top to bottom, it decomposes it. It's a simple way to sort of explain how a system works. People who are familiar with use case writing can adapt to mapping really well because it's. If you take a big use case for your system and figure out where the beginning is and where the end is, all the steps in between become what I call the backbone, the top of the map. Mm-hmm. We've also been talking about breaking big things down into little things. One of the things I show people in a class is if you've got a feature or a big thing that needs to be broken down, if you just identify who it's for and tell me what people are going to use it. If you were to tell a story about that, somebody using that feature, where's the beginning and where's the end? If you tell that story, it's easy to take that big feature and break it down by using a map. And then the pieces that are in that map become, smaller things that we could build. Also, by breaking it down, we start to consider what's optional or what's necessary and how else would other people do it. So this big visualization allows people to start with a big idea and spray it out and break it down in lots of small things. Mm. And your original question is, what do people lose by not doing that? If the purpose of stories was shared understanding or getting on the same page, well, there's a bunch of different models ways we could use to try and help people understand the big picture. But a map is something that's super simple to build, and when people work together to build it, they build shared understanding. They start with a big story, they spray it out on a wall, and they get on the same page and understand that thing from a user's perspective. They clear up misunderstandings where I thought it was one way and you thought it was another way, and ultimately they have to. It's funny, all of our threads are coming together here. One of the things that a story map is super good for is, once I've got it all sprayed out on the wall with lots of options, then I can then ask, what is the smallest release that would be successful for this product? That's where that slicing thing comes in. So it allows us to do this collaboratively instead of, the arguments go a lot faster when we're all on the same page. We all so to find that smallest successful release, that conversation goes a lot more smoothly when we all have the same understanding of what this thing is and what all of our options are with it.
Yeah, we just talked a little bit about the map and obviously how these things are being broken down. In your book, there's a lot of material. There's stickies, index cards. It's very visual, like references are in your book. Your talks, as many know, is also very hands-on on paper and pen. How do you do this in organizations? Like, is there any kind of tools you use electronically? Do you think that would fit for companies, or would you always prefer paper and pen?
So this is where I remind people, if we go back to Agile principles, that where is it? I was looking for the Agile. I brought it up on my computer while we were talking. The most efficient and effective method to convey information and within a development team is face-to-face conversation.
That's right.
So, full stop. If you want to have as efficient a conversation as possible, doing it face to face is a lot better. Anything else is something less. So in organizations where they say, okay, well we're not co-located, or we don't have wall space or things like that, how do we do this? It's sort of like asking, how do I run marathons with ankle weights? Well, you can train and you can get good at it, but I promise you're not going to beat people who don't do that. So that said, bear in mind that any other solutions don't work well. If there's a lot of tools these days that people use. There's a tool called Mural. It's at mural.co. There's a tool called Cardboard, or it's at cardboardhit.com. But people are using. I'm terrible at this. I have people that there are plugins for Jira, something called Easy Agile that plugs into Jira that lets you do these kinds of things. There are more and more tools that allow people to from remote locations to collaborate together, and they're not tools that share a screen. They're tools that allow people to see the same screen and everybody at every location to change what's on the screen.
Right.
So any tool that allows you to do that allows people to collaborate together on these things.
Well, one of the things I've noticed is that when we're talking especially about your work, you're seeing the big picture of things, right?
Yeah.
And it just doesn't fit on a screen, and then the scrolling begins, and you just don't have the information in front of you. So it's kind of a difficult way. I think you had a good metaphor here, right? It's a difficult way of seeing the big picture by only looking at a zoomed piece of it, and none of the tools I have been working with in this particular area has been really useful. And nothing has really been better, as you said, as index cards or stickies to that extent. So that is that's cool. How do you feel about the no estimate movement?
Yeah. Actually, I want to say one more thing
Oh
about
yeah,
that last
go
concept
for it.
before we switch over to the no estimate thing.
Yeah.
But look, it's always been this way in software. I think I can remember even before Agile having big things on walls. I can remember big things that we printed out on plotters that would show the architecture of our system, and
Oh
we'd
yeah.
look at it and marvel at all those little pieces. And it wasn't even it would fill a whole wall, or it would be a big poster printed on a plotter that would show the architecture of our system, and you had to step up and read really close to see all the words. We've always had this problem. It sucks to system. It would be cool if systems fit onto A4 pages, but it's just not the way it works.
Yes.
It's always been that. It's always been that way. And then when we add a layer of collaboration onto it, where we want people to collaborate together on big things, it just is. No matter how big you project things onto a wall, computers are constrained by the resolution of the screen you're looking at. They're just not. They're not as high resolution as the real world. You look on the no estimates thing. Oh boy, that's been coming up an awful lot. I think what do I think about it? I've met a lot of people behind that movement. Oh shoot, who are the names behind that? When you think of no estimates,
I can't think of a name.
Okay.
But
that's just going to be horribly embarrassing. We're going to have to, because I've met several people, and I'm drawing a blank this morning. Not enough coffee today. But the idea is hitting us with this reality that the estimate, first off, the word estimate is an oxymoron. First off, accurate estimate is an oxymoron. And everybody in software development that knows that when you say estimate, what you mean is commitment. What for all the no estimates people I've talked to, what they talk about doing is still breaking things down, still measuring how long things take, or we talk about. Some of the most effective Agile teams I've worked with have stopped estimating and have moved to card counting. They've got good at breaking down stories to things, breaking down big stories to small stories that can be done in a couple days, and then every couple weeks they count how many of those they finished, and it allows them to figure out how fast that they're moving. The one thing that concerns me is that if people take the idea of no estimates to be equal to no commitment, that starts to be a problem. That's something that doesn't work in the product world. If you I started by building software for brick and mortar retailers, and there are real world constraints. When we shipped out software, we had to roll it out to a chain of retailers. We had to finish rollouts before October, because they're not going to move Christmas. The outside world doesn't change, and while we couldn't precisely say exactly what we were going to ship, we could sort of say what was going to be there, what big things were going to be there, and what weren't. And anybody listening to this knows that if you work for a company, you can't just say, I don't know what I'm going to give you, and I don't know when. That doesn't fly, not in the real world. You ultimately need to say what are we going to get and when. The cool thing, again, everything's tying back together here. If you break big things down into small things, you measure how long it takes you to build small things, you can start to get pretty predictable. But it's not the same. I think people have tried too much to get accurate estimates.
But still a prediction, right? So you're still making some form of forecasting or some form of estimates, even though they're, not accurate. And I think that's pretty much what that movement is also about, is saying that the estimates are not accurate. Well, we're coming to the end here, Jeff, but I do want to ask you, just a little bit for the listeners. You're very visionary. What's on your agenda these days? What are you working on? What trends are you seeing in the industry as something important to observe? Give the listener something you feel like that is either in your personal environment where you're working on. I don't know if you're working on another book or if there's anything you're focusing on, papers or talks. And
Yeah.
what is it? Maybe around user stories or mapping or products, anything.
Yeah, well, a lot of the themes that we've been talking about here, a lot of the things that are on my mind lately, the two things. Well, I guess the thing I am wondering about more lately, or the thing I focus on lately, is what are we going to be left with when, or what's next after we combine everything we learned from doing Agile well, and we start to roll in all the things we learned from doing products well, all the things we learned from doing experimentation, all the things that come from lean startup and lean UX. More and more, I work with organizations that are adopting a more product-centric posture, and it means that one of the things that hits you over the head when you're working with Scrum is this idea of potentially shippable software. But when you embrace that concept of an MVP as a next best test, well, we don't want to ship our tests. Or we only, if we do ship them, they're in the form of an A/B test or something to a small subset of audience. They definitely don't need to scale. So what does a process look like when it combines a whole team, and that whole team is not just accountable for our on-time delivery, but accountable for product success, and they use a blend of shippable software, shipping at scale, and shipping or working with tests when they all work on that. What we're trying to arrive at is what's after common agile practice, or what is if I get my butt going on a next book, it will be that. It's funny, the handouts I use for workshops now are well over 120 pages, so they're almost a book, just not well written, but it's turning that work into a book. That's what's on my mind lately, is what does agile practice look like when it leverages everything we've learned so far and gets rid of some of the anti-patterns, out focusing on delivering more stuff faster, and moves towards focusing on success.
Awesome, Jeff. Thank you so much. I do want to thank you. Much appreciated your time to spend here with me and give the listeners some insights of into your thinking around user story mapping, products, customers, and all of those nice things we just talked about. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Joe. Good to talk to you.
Thank you for listening to Agile.FM, the radio for the Agile community. I'm your host, Joe Krebs. If you're interested in more programming and additional podcasts, please go to www.agile.fm. Talk to you soon.